Hi, let's take a look at getting to know your mason bees. Mason bees are a gentle bee. They are ideal for cities and backyards as they rarely sting. They're not aggressive. They're solitary. They don't have a hive to protect. And they only fly about 300 feet from their nesting boxes. Out of all of the bees, the mason bee is one of the most efficient at pollination. So how did the mason bee get its name? Is it named for Mason County in Washington State? Well, no, not really. It gets its name because it uses mud in the construction of its nest. And we're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes. They are early pollinators of fruit tree. The mason bee is often referred to as the orchard bee because of that. The mason bee carries pollen on their abdominal hairs rather than in pollen baskets like you would find with bumblebees or honeybees. So just kind of imagine this right now as the mason bee flies from flower to flower. Some of the pollen attached to their abdominal hairs gets deposited as they land on the next flower that they visit. So this makes them one of the most effective bees at cross-pollination. And they visit, it's estimated 1,100 flowers in a day. And you can think, oh my gosh, that sounds like an awful lot. But think about how many blossoms are in an orchard. The mason bee nests are in above ground cavities. They do not excavate a nest. So in nature, the female is going to find existing nesting sites like in wood, holes that were excavated by beetles, or maybe in hollow reeds. They will readily accept the tubes that are set up in the mason bee nesting boxes. Now, there are many mason bee enthusiasts who provide nesting boxes to enhance pollination of their fruit trees in early spring flowers and trees. So even though these are solitary bees, the mason bees can live in close proximity in these nesting boxes. Place the nesting tubes out into the box, generally kind of beginning to the mid-March period. And it's a good idea to put the boxes at eye level so you can see how they're doing. It's kind of fun to watch the activity. You want to place it off to the southeast, and that way they'll catch the early morning sun and help warm up the bees. And one thing is that they are fairly picky about tube diameter, and they prefer this diameter size of 5/16 of an inch. So this is big enough to allow their body to pass through the tube, but it's not so large that they need to go out and collect excess mud to build these partitions. The tubes need to be 6 inches long so that both male and female eggs can be laid. The mason bee has an annual life cycle. So the bees are going to emerge from their cocoons by the end of March, and they're going to need several days of temperatures that are 57 degrees or more. If you've cleaned your cocoons, you can set them out a couple weeks before your fruit trees go into blossom. The male bees emerge first, and they're going to wait for the females to emerge a couple weeks later. Sometimes the males will actually actively extract the females from their nests in order to mate. After mating, the male bee will die. The female stores the semen, and she's going to use it to fertilize the egg if she wants a female offspring. The unfertilized eggs will become male. So just notice a couple of identifiers here. You can see how much smaller the male mason bee is. And you'll notice that it has this shock of white hairs on its head. When the female emerges in March, she's going to have gone almost a year without feeding. So now her body has been depleted by its long state of diapause or rest, and she's going to need to immediately feed on pollen and nectar to rebuild her body. She's going to search for suitable sites for her nest, and once she finds a nesting hole, she's going to collect nectar and pollen and deposit it in the back of the hole. So their favorite food is fruit tree pollen plus some of its nectar. The female is going to collect the pollen and bring it back to the nest. She's going to knead it into a ball, mixing it with the nectar and her own saliva. And once they have enough food, they're going to lay an egg on top of the mass. Afterwards, they're going to build a little mud wall to seal off the cell or chamber, and then they're going to start gathering food for the next chamber. Now, this is a really fun time for bee watching, as the bees are very active as they're provisioning the nest. One of the things that makes bees unique to other pollinators is they actively seek out pollen to feed their young. So the pollen is a protein source for the bee's development, and the nectar provides energy for the bee. She's going to continue collecting pollen and nectar and laying eggs until she's got about 25 to 30 eggs that she's laid. So that averages about 1 to 2 eggs a day. And look at this image of her with a bright yellow pollen on the rows of these pollen collecting hairs on her abdomen. Let's take a look at the nest profile. You can see the mud partitions that separate each egg and pollen nectar meal. The females are placed to the back of the tube with the male eggs at the end, as they're going to be the first to emerge. She's going to seal the entrance of the tube with a thicker wall of mud to deter the predators. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to harvest the mud for the mason bee partitions. Think about it, they're only carrying a grain of mud at a time. So consider putting mud near the nesting box to help the bees save energy as they build these partitions. And remember, they'll do better with clay-like soil rather than sandy soil. It's going to build a better partition. I've also read if you don't have a source of exposed mud, they may not inhabit the nesting box. Let's take a look at how the larvae develop. The eggs will hatch within a few days. The larvae will emerge and they'll start to feed. And it takes almost 3 weeks for the larvae to consume the food. And you can just see how as the larvae get bigger and bigger, the food supply gets smaller and smaller. And then the end image, you can see the start of the formation of their gray cocoon. Once the tubes are capped off in June, and capped off means that the process is finished, the tubes are full, and there's mud at the tip of the tube. So once the tubes are capped off, you can take your bees and store them someplace that is protected. So to give you an idea, ideally you want to put them in a cabinet, in a shed, with a door that is made with screen door screening to keep the parasitic wasps away. Now, near the end of the summer, the bees will transform into their adult stage, but they're going to remain in the cocoon throughout the winter. And I just think this is just one of the most amazing things, in that they're in these cocoons, they're fully formed bee, they have wings and all, but they're not going to leave the cocoon until springtime. So what are the bees doing in this time in their cocoon? Are they just sleeping like a bear in hibernation? There's actually a distinction. Insects don't go through hibernation. Instead, they go through what's called diapause. So diapause is a state of temporary dormancy that's marked by a pause in their growth and development. So even though our bee is a fully formed bee, it cannot emerge as an adult. As we're moving into winter weather, it's going to be cold and there's going to be no food resources for them. So the mason bee is going to pause its development. It's going to stay inside the cocoon and go into dormancy instead, and then it will emerge in the spring. Hibernation is different in that it is just a state of metabolic slowdown. It's used by some animals to survive the extreme weather conditions. The animals don't go through some pause in their development though, they're fully formed. Now, in our mason bee life cycle, we're going to say it's March. The weather's warming up. The trees are starting to blossom. Our mason bees are going to chew their way out of the cocoons. with this warmer temperature. And they're going to start this whole cycle of life over again. Now, just because you're a mason bee does not mean that your life is without danger. There are many things that can happen in the day in a life of a mason bee. So let's take a look and see what some of these things are, and let's see if there's some things we can do to keep them safe. There are parasitic wasps that are at peril. Parasitic wasps, such as the Chelted wasps, will pierce the cocoons with their ovipositor, and they're going to inject the wasp eggs into the cocoon. Those wasp eggs will hatch into larvae, and they're going to feed on the little mason bee that is in the cocoon. Eventually, they will devour it. So notice the lower image, you're going to see the hole in the paper tube. If you look, there's a corresponding hole in the cocoon that is behind it. The parasitic larvae eventually inside the cocoon go through metamorphosis. They're going to emerge as an adult to start this process of parasitizing other insects again. The hole that you see in the cocoon and then out through the paper tube is the wasp's emergence hole. So as an adult, they're emerging out to start this process again. You can decrease the risk of parasitic wasps by taking the nesting tubes down in June and storing them in a protected screen cabinet, for example, in a shed. And I do want to say this about parasitic wasps. As a whole, they're considered a beneficial insect, and they're considered biological control against many insect pests. So they are going to be parasitizing insect pests like aphids and garden pests, and they even use them in orchards to help control pests such as the codling moth and the brown marmorated stink bug. Pollen mites are also a peril. They are kleptoparasites, which means that they are going to feed on the pollen and nectar meal intended for the bee. So they'll reproduce, and they're going to eat all of the intended food for that little bee larvae. So the mason bee larvae will starve and die. So once again, cleaning the cocoons will kill the pollen mites, and that will help your mason bee. Houdini flies are non-natives. They're actually from Europe, and they ended up here in the United States in the last just few years. They are tiny. They're a gray fruit fly. So just like the fruit flies that you have sometimes late summer in your kitchen area around your fruit, they are also fruit flies, and they have these bright red eyes. So that tells you how tiny they are. The adult female fly will fly into the mason bee's nesting tube, and she's going to lay her eggs on the pollen nectar meal that the female mason bee has deposited for her little bee larvae. The fly maggots are kleptoparasites. They're going to feed on that pollen nectar meal intended for the bee larvae, causing the mason bee larvae to starve and die. So you can help protect the mason bee from the Houdini fly. Notice on the lower image, all those little golden maggot, the larvae of the Houdini fly. So as you clean your cocoons, as you're harvesting and cleaning your cocoons, make sure that you crush and kill all of those Houdini fly larvae. Another peril is chalk brood. So this is a fungal infection that's going to kill the bee larvae. So the fungal spores are transferred to the eggs during nest building. The fungal spores get into that pollen nectar meal. The larvae will feed on now the spore infested pollen nectar meal. They'll die, but the fungus is going to continue to grow and produce more spores. So once again, another reason to clean your cocoons. We found a couple surprises too in this whole process. One of the older nesting boxes, which was up by Catalyst, which is in Shelton. It's the food bank garden that the master gardeners use for growing food for our food bank. We found that one of the old nesting boxes was loaded with yellow jackets. Now, yellow jackets are predators on other insects. So this was a time that the mason bees were just beginning to emerge. So we carefully reached in there and moved the tubes to a new nesting box that was nearby. Also, another surprise was the Japanese horn-faced bee. So this, once again, is a non-native bee. It's been in North America since 1984, and it's a solitary bee, fairly similar to the blue orchard mason bee. So it's also a mason bee. It's a very efficient pollinator of fruit and almond trees. And I want you just to look at the cocoon profile. So notice the bottom row, you're going to see these two big kind of chunky dark colored cocoons. Those are the cocoons of the blue orchard mason bee. But look at the row above, you're going to see that they're silvery in color. And they are the cocoons of the Japanese horn-faced bee. There's a little saying that they look like a string of pearls, and they really do. Just recently, I went down to Southern Washington and helped someone clean cocoons. And we cleaned 2,000 cocoons, and about a third of the cocoons that we cleaned were these Japanese horn-faced bees. Now, the mason bee is an incredible value. It's an important spring pollinator. It's extremely efficient at transferring pollen. And the mason bee adults are short-lived. So the males, remember, only live to be about 2 weeks. The females only 4 to 6 weeks. So they're very short-lived spring pollinator, but they have a big impact on early season pollination. Caring for the bees is really a grassroots effort by all of the gardeners, the fruit tree growers, and the bee enthusiasts who love mason bees. So now, why don't we take a look at a demonstration on how to build a mason bee nesting box. Kitty, kitty, kitty. I stopped sharing because I stopped recording. Should I just end?